Ladies and gentlemen, honored guests, our speaker today held what has been described as the biggest and toughest job in Canadian broadcasting, president of the CBC, until recently. As you all know, Tony Manera resigned from that job last month when the federal government made that tough job even tougher. He quit on a matter of principle when the government failed to honor its commitment to maintain and stabilize CBC funding. Only last February, Tony Manera had accepted the job of president of the CBC on the condition that the Liberal government live up to the promise of no new cuts to the CBC's parliamentary subsidy. The recent federal budget reduced the Crown Corporation subsidy by roughly $44 million. There is even some indication that more cuts are to come. To meet these revenue shortfalls, the CBC may be forced to downsize by changing or abandoning some services and by laying off a substantial part of their 9,000 employees. So the CBC is again thrust into a time of transition and turmoil, when our cultural institutions most need strengthening. As we become citizens of the global economy, surfers of the 5,000 channel universe, and users of the information highway, we need reminding more than ever of who we are and what it means to be Canadian. At present, there is perhaps no better vehicle than the CBC to instill a sense of nationhood. The government has adopted another task force to study and review the mandate of the CBC. It would make a great plot for the sitcom, Yes, Minister. Tony Manera's own history reads like the classic Canadian success story. He immigrated to Canada from Italy as a young lad of 11, grew up in Montreal, and then moved to the United States for his post-secondary education. He earned his Bachelor of Science degree in Electronics Engineering in 1958 at the University of Southern California, worked for Hughes Aircraft and Teledyne Systems before returning to university to acquire a Master of Science in Electrical Engineering. In 1965, he returned to Canada to teach electronics, first at Ryerson and then at Sir Stanford Fleming College in Peterborough, before moving on to Confederation College in Thunder Bay. In 1971, he was appointed president of Niagara College, the youngest president ever. In 1978, he moved to British Columbia to become the president of Vancouver Community College. Mr. Manera joined the CBC as Vice President of Human Resources in 1985, responsible for about 12,000 full-time employees. A year later, he was appointed Senior Vice President. He was appointed Acting President of the CBC on November 1, 1993, and became President and Chief Executive Officer on February 3, 1994. Tony has agreed to accept questions from the floor following his delivery. I tell you this now so you can think of it. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in giving a warm Canadian Club welcome to Mr. Tony Manera.
Thank you, Mr. President, head table guests, friends, ladies and gentlemen. I know you expect me to talk about the CBC today, and I certainly intend to do that. But I can't do it without first talking about Canada, since in many respects the CBC is a reflection of our country. Canada today faces many significant challenges. The national debt, regional and linguistic tensions, the state of the economy and of the physical environment. These are some of the issues that worry most Canadians. And yet, if you travel around the world, you can't help but realize that most of the planet's other inhabitants would gladly trade their problems for ours. Indeed, as Canadians, we have much to be thankful for. Our standard of living is relatively high, and our overall quality of life, with some exceptions, is also excellent. In spite of our proximity to the world's largest cultural, economic, and military power, we have built a country with its own identity and set of values, further enriched by a vibrant French-speaking cultural presence. On the world scene, in spite of our small population, we are active participants in important clubs such as the G7, and we contribute disproportionately to peacekeeping efforts around the globe. Indeed, Canadian citizenship is a valued asset and a source of great pride, not only for Canadians who were born in Canada, but also for those Canadians who, like myself, were welcomed into Canada from other lands. This country called Canada is a great achievement. Historically, now more than ever before, the forces that propel economic activity have been acting in a north-south direction. On that basis, Canada is an illogical country. It is not a country invented by economists. It is a country invented by people of vision who could see beyond the balance sheet and who forged a compact based on compromise, creating a balance among the linguistic, regional, economic, and geographic tensions that mitigated against the development of a cohesive political entity. One of the most important factors contributing to the success of the Canadian story has been the recognition by Canadians of the value of public institutions in complementing and sometimes supplementing market forces in order to achieve public policy objectives. In the case of the CBC, that objective has been to provide what I refer to as electronic glue, an invisible link that enables Canadians to speak to each other, to laugh at each other, and hopefully to understand each other better. Many other countries have also recognized that cultural development cannot be left entirely to market forces. In fact, it can be argued that public support of culture is the foundation of great civilizations. As Max Frankl recently wrote in the New York Times Magazine, without government subsidy and tax-supported philanthropy, there would be no great universities, no great libraries, no great museums, no grand opera, or even basic science. How does the CBC perform its role? It does it in many ways, of course. It provides unrestricted public access to important national events. It informs Canadians about events around the globe from a Canadian perspective. It sets the pace in terms of establishing standards of broadcast quality. It leads with non-violent programming for children, such as Mr. Dress-Up, Theodore Tugboat, Fred Penner's Place, and Canadian Sesame Street. It applies new technology by bringing digital radio to Canada, for example. It provides a cultural showcase for Canadian talent of all kinds. It makes it possible for Canadian producers, directors, technicians, actors, and musicians to develop and to display to the world a country and a culture of immense sophistication. Annual audience surveys consistently give the CBC high marks for keeping Canadians informed about events across the country, contributing to the public's general knowledge, and encouraging Canadian artists. In a national survey conducted last fall, the CBC was chosen as the network with the best Canadian programs by almost 3 times more people than any other network. Each week, at one time or another, more than 16 million Canadians watch English television, while 5.7 million watch French television. English radio has nearly 3.4 million listeners, and French radio has maintained its reach of about 1 million in the toughest radio market in Canada. When you add that all up, radio and television, English and French, networks and regions, more than 25 million Canadians tune into CBC every week. No matter how you look at it, a broadcaster whose services are watched or heard by more than 25 million people a week is indeed providing a rich and varied service that is demonstrably valued by its audiences. And the CBC does that at a per capita cost to the taxpayer of less than a dime per day, virtually unchanged from 10 years ago, in spite of inflation. Can any other public service make a similar claim? But in spite of its tremendous reach into the everyday lives of Canadians, the CBC's future is being questioned as never before. First, there is the 500-channel universe. And I heard Mr. Phillips say 5,000. Whatever it is, 500 or 5,000. It's the first argument. People will say, with all these channels, why do we still need the CBC? We haven't got time to watch them all. And then there is the view that, the deficit. We can't afford the CBC with the huge deficit and the debt. Because even at 10 cents a day, it adds up to around $1 billion a year. So that's a lot of money. And finally, some people will leave broadcasting exclusively to the private sector to be entirely shaped by the marketplace. These are the 3 most often heard reasons or arguments why we can do without the CBC. The 500-channel universe, the deficit, and let the markets do it. Well, let's start with the 500-channel universe. It isn't here yet, but it's coming, at least in terms of channel capacity, whether it's through coaxial cable, satellite dishes, or optical fiber. The technology is dazzling. But people don't watch coaxial cable. They don't watch satellite dishes. They don't watch optical fiber. They watch programs. And while distribution costs are certainly going to drop, producing programs, high-quality programs, the cost of doing that hasn't all of a sudden dropped. So that brings up the question, of all the content in this multi-channel universe, how much of it will be Canadian? The answer is that most of it will not be Canadian. It will not reflect Canada's regions. That is an inevitable consequence of the economics of production that favor U.S. domination of cultural products consumed in Canada. That's why today 60% of the books, 90% of the records, 64% of television programs, and 94% of films shown in Canada originate abroad. That is why in prime time, from 7 p.m. to 11 p.m., were it not for the CBC, our television screens would be almost entirely dominated by U.S. programming. Now, in a democratic society, we cannot and we should not prevent access to this vast supply of foreign material. What we must do, however, is to ensure that there is a constant supply of high-quality Canadian cultural product in our bookstores, on our magazine racks, in our record stores, in our theaters, on our television screens, and on radio. Without such a supply, we are at the mercy of forces that seem to conspire to homogenize us. A global economy, easy travel, global communications, all acting to loosen the bonds that bind us to the country. What works to keep us together? After You've said the CBC. What do you say next? UIC? We must have at least one national institution to pull Canadians back together, to share, if only for a few minutes, something that is uniquely ours, like Paul Anderson's goal. And let's not forget the role played by Radio-Canada in the development of a dynamic French-Canadian culture. At a time when many Quebecois feel that the best way to safeguard the French language and the French culture is to separate from Canada, it is worth noting that one of the most successful instruments of French-Canadian cultural development has been and continues to be a federal institution called Radio-Canada. In fact, in the words of Chantal Hébert, parliamentary correspondent for La Presse, Radio-Canada is a rare federal institution that has almost unanimous support in Quebec. There are many reasons for this popularity, not the least of which are the many thoughtful information and musical programs on radio, as well as the famous téléroman and children's programming that have standards of excellence, have set standards of excellence in French-Canadian television for many years. But there's also Radio-Canada's coverage of international events on radio and television through a network of French-Canadian correspondents without whom our viewers and listeners would learn of such events largely from foreign sources. No wonder the credibility of Radio-Canada's international coverage among adult francophones is nearly twice that of its nearest competitor. To eliminate the CBC, the only institution that every Canadian can turn to in crisis and triumph, or to strip it of its popular programming or most visible services, would be to lose the vital capacity of the CBC. And to do that would erode our very reason for being, our belief that we as Canadians have created something different and better on the northern half of this continent. Who will believe this of Canada if its television, the most powerful communications medium in human history, is dominated by all things American? Surely Canada is much more than 27 million customers to be delivered to advertisers. Is Canada not also a vast set of diverse experiences to be shared? Is it not great purposes to be held in common? Is it not undreamed of opportunities to be fulfilled together? Is it not passing on to a new generations of Canadians what we found when we first came to this country, only better? And if it is to be any of these things, is it not essential that Canada have an authentic voice of its own? That our country have at least one way to make sure that Canadian voices can be heard, one place to turn to when there's danger to be confronted or triumph to be shared, one means to share with all other Canadians in the experiences of Canada? Preferably, we should have many ways in which we can come together. But the reality is that we do not have many ways. We have the CBC. What other broadcaster allows Canadians to speak directly to other Canadians in every corner of our country through that wonderful, gritty interlocutor, Rex Murphy, every Sunday on Cross Country Checkup? What other institution offers 99% of Canadians a Peter Zosky to keep us thinking, a Pam Wallen and a Peter Mansbridge to keep us informed, a Royal Canadian Air Force to keep us laughing, and a Don Cherry to keep getting under our skin? Only the CBC does. Only the CBC can. So to those who say that we don't need the CBC in a 500-channel universe, I say they are wrong. The very power of the 500-channel universe to fragment Canada makes the CBC imperative. Can I just have water? Thank you. So much for the 500-channel universe. But then there's the deficit. People are saying, well, can we still afford the CBC? You know, no responsible Canadian can argue that the deficit and the debt must be eliminated. All of us as citizens must do our share. Is the CBC doing its share? Good question. Since 1985, the CBC has been in the forefront of budget cutting. In fact, in 94-85, the funding from government was $905 million. This year, it's $1,065 million, which is an increase of 17.7%. But after you take into account inflation, it's essentially a decline of almost 25%. And during that time, the CBC reduced its workforce by 25% as well, or 3,000 employees. Now, to understand the CBC performance, we needed to compare it to something. So I've chosen to compare it with the federal government's performance. Over the same period of time, the federal government increased its spending by 63% instead of the 17% for the CBC. So I just did a little calculation. If federal government spending over the past 11 years had increased at the same rate as the CBC appropriation, you know something? Instead of a $32 billion deficit this year, we would have a $15 billion surplus. And Mr. Martin could be looking at tax cuts. Isn't that something? So, to say the CBC hasn't done its share, or it doesn't face fiscal reality, is really to argue against the facts. But people will say, oh, well, yeah, but you know, there's still a deficit, so there's more restraint and more cost cutting on the way. So the CBC can't be spared further pain. Absolutely. The CBC never asked to be spared further pain. The CBC strategic plan, which I presented to Parliament last November, and I'm delighted to see Mr. Godfrey, who is here as the chairman of the parliamentary committee, that strategic plan was based on getting $100 million less from the government than we were getting now. So in spite of the fact that over the last 11 years, the CBC has outperformed the federal government by such a vast amount, the CBC was planned to ask $100 million less. Plus no funding increases for salaries, no funding increases for inflation. So how were we going to do that? Well, the CBC was going to embark on the most ambitious cost-cutting program in its history. We were planning to reduce expenses by $120 million a year, cut staff by another 1,000 employees on top of the 3,000 that we already did, while maintaining services to the public. In fact, we actually hope to improve services to the public by becoming more Canadian, by reducing advertising, strengthening regional services, doing more children's and performance programming, and filling some gaps in radio services. The emphasis on Canadian and regional content was a direct response to the multi-channel universe. Only by emphasizing these qualities could the CBC remain distinctive in a sea of Hollywood-inspired productions. The CBC strategic plan did not impress those whose vision of the CBC is that of a national broadcaster without a regional presence. Such a CBC, in my view, would not be a true reflection of Canada, which is anything but a monolithic country. Unfortunately, the financial assumptions upon which the strategic plan was based no longer apply. When one combines budget cuts that were already planned with cuts announced in last February's federal budget and cuts contemplated in the government's multi-year operational plan, the overall shortfall faced by the CBC by April 1, 1997, which is less than 2 years from now, is around $350 million problem. How do you solve a $350 million problem? There's a lot of suggestions, a lot of ideas. I'm sure most of them offered in good faith. Some of them will work. They were already included in the $100 million cuts that we were planning. But not all of them will work. One of the options frequently advocated is for the CBC to abandon over-the-air transmission of its television services leaving it up to cable and other developing distribution media to carry its signals. That'll probably turn out to be a viable idea as those media actually become available several years down the road, but it's not viable today. In fact, 35% of television audiences for the CBC are reached over the air. The CBC would lose those viewers if it were restricted to cable only. It would also lose the commercial revenue that's attached to them. And replicating the terrestrial system from space would mean using a lot more satellite channels than it needs to now. So far from saving money, shutting off television transmitters will cost the CBC at least $50 million in additional expenses as well as lost revenue, and will lose 35% of its audience. So it's not a solution. In fact, there are no easy solutions to a $350 million problem. If there were, I would still be president. For most of us, $350 million is such a large number that it loses all meaning. So let me illustrate for you by indicating the net cost to the taxpayer after deducting advertising revenue of various CBC services. Remember, there's a $350 million problem. All of English television, programming, network, and regional, after deducting advertising revenue, costs $270 million. So you could shut down English television tomorrow. You would save $270 million for the taxpayer. But there's a $350 million problem. So shutting down English television won't do it. How about French television? $190 million. So that won't do it. How about radio? Shut down all radio. English, French, mono, stereo, network, and regional, all of it. $245 million. How about the distribution system? English, French, television, radio, terrestrial, satellite, microwave, everything. Save $130 million. So no matter how you're going to do it, $350 million is not going to be found by playing around the margins. It will require amputations. Between 3,000 and 4,000 CBC employees will lose their jobs. That's on top of the 3,000 we already have. And you know, it's people who make programs. Let's not make any mistake about that. All the hardware in the world will not produce a newscast or a variety show or a dramatic program without people. I'm not quoting these numbers to advocate any specific option, but only to illustrate my view that you cannot reduce spending by $350 million without cutting the heart and soul of the CBC, one of the very few institutions that helps define us as Canadians. And cuts of this magnitude, to the extent that they would apply to the television news operations, and they would have to, would place both News World and its French counterpart, Réseau de l'Information, at serious risk. These two cable all news channels, currently provided at no incremental cost to the taxpayer, depend heavily on the existing infrastructure of the main channels. Well, why not let the private sector do it? That way you can eliminate the need for the CBC altogether. You can forget all about that. Well, I have a lot of respect for the private sector. We have a lot of strategic alliances, including with my friend Doug Bassett. He may not be my friend anymore after he hears my speech, but I really mean that sincerely. The CBC values its alliances with the private sector. But there's also a recognition that the private sector is ruled by market forces. And my answer to the question, why not let the private sector do it, is if the private sector could do what the CBC does, why is it not doing it now? The answer is economics. The cost of producing Canadian programs, with few exceptions, such as professional sports, as an example, cannot be covered by the available advertising revenue. That is why the private sector does not cover such events as the Canada Games, le Jeux de la Francophonie, the Commonwealth Games, le Congrès Mondial Acadien, or the Governor General's Awards, and is able to produce so little Canadian drama or children's programming. Let me illustrate my point by looking at the television schedule for Sunday night, March 26, between 7 and 11 p.m., the heart of prime time. On CBC, you could watch Road to Avonlea, the Juno Awards, honoring excellence in Canadian music, followed by Sunday Report and Venture. 4 hours of first-class, 100% Canadian television programming. On CTV, you could watch America's Funniest Home Videos, followed by, guess what? Another episode of America's Funniest Home Videos. Then the new adventures of Superman, and a 2-hour movie, Sleep, Baby, Sleep. How much of these 4 hours of television programming on CTV was Canadian? Zero. Absolutely zero. I'm not being critical of the CTV schedule. And now that Doug is chairman of CTV, I expect there'll be some changes. It is driven by economic reality. But such a comparison, which I do not sincerely mean as a criticism, it illustrates precisely why Canada needs a publicly funded broadcaster. It is part of the cost of nation building. At some point, the obvious question has to be asked. Given the heavy dependence of our economy on the U.S. economy, if most of our cultural products also originate in the U.S., is there any point in pretending that Canada is a separate country? Can there really be political independence without cultural independence? This CBC is not a perfect institution. You know, Canada is not a perfect country either. Both need improvement. I hope that together we can find a way to achieve those improvements without destroying either one. Thank you very much.
We have a few minutes for questions. The microphones are on either side of the podium, and I ask that you direct your questions into the microphone for the benefit of the audience here.
Mr. Chairman, seeing that the guest speaker singled out CTV and the private sector, as one who was intimately involved in the private sector, I just would like to reconfirm and agree what Mr. Manera had said to us today. He is absolutely right in our opinion and my opinion with reference to the CBC. They do need our support, and it is a meaningful institution in this country which should be preserved. And let's give them 11 cents a day for Canadian citizens, so it shall be conserved.
Thank you.
On that note, I will call on Libby Burnham to say a few words of thanks.
CBC has, as Tony has said, been for many Canadians part of the building of our country and the unifying force that has linked us. It has presented our stories from one part of the country to the other. It has made us speak to one another and to share our experiences. I was privileged to serve as a member of the board of the directors of the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation for 6 years, so I had a chance to really learn the breadth and the depth of what the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation does for this country. During that time, I also had an opportunity to learn to appreciate the creative talent that is in the CBC and that it nurtures, and the commitment that exists within the corporation by the management. Tony Manera has exemplified the commitment of management to Canada and to the corporation. I had hoped, when I asked him to speak to the Canadian Club of Toronto, that I would have the opportunity to offer him words of advice on matters which, when I was on the board, I was wont to give him on occasion. But I'm sorry I'm not going to have that opportunity. However, in keeping with his reputation for integrity, he tendered his resignation to the government effective last Friday as president of the CBC. We appreciate him taking time to come today and to talk about the future of the CBC and the impact of budget cuts. Canadians will have to determine and make it clear to the government what kind of a public broadcasting system they want and the price that they are prepared to pay for it. We thank you, Tony, for sharing your thoughts with us today, and on behalf of the Canadian Club of Toronto, I thank you for being with us. Thank you.